Welcome to Global Forum. Today's discussion is about building peace in South Asia. And we invited two very distinguished guests. We have with us Professor Sanjoy Banerjee. He's the Department Chair of International Relations Studies Department at the San Francisco State University. He is also an international relations theorist and a journalist or a columnist with India Currents magazine. Welcome, Professor Banerjee.
Thank you.
And we have Tariq, who is an internationally known author of 22 books. And I think you know him better than I need to define him. So he's here, Tariq, author of many books, an international orator, and truly a global voice for peace and justice. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Now, Tariq Sahab, you have been working on this issue for a long time. This is something that both your parents have worked for and you have worked for. This is a family legacy of building peace and justice. What are the prospects of building peace in our own lifetime?
Depends how long we've got now. But I think, I don't know how long it's going to take, but I think we have to carry on fighting for it. Look, it's no longer a question of dismantling any state. You know, that's foolish, counterproductive. But what we have to work towards in South Asia, I think, is a South Asia Union on the model of the European Union, but better than that. The European Union is a union of wealth and bankers. We can have a South Asian Union which actually begins to help the ordinary people in that part of the world and reduces any chance at all of war between these states. Pakistan and India are nuclear states. Any war between them, and neither side has said that they won't use nuclear weapons, would be a disaster for the region. So we have now in South Asia, I would say, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal. Some countries small, some larger. It is in their combined interests and individual interests to work together and within this framework find a solution for the two problems that have damaged relations in the country, in this region, Kashmir and the Tamil question in Sri Lanka. If you have a new entity created which doesn't challenge the sovereignty of any existing state, but begins to work together, I think within that framework, some form of autonomy for Kashmir and the Tamil areas within the South Asia Union could become a possibility. So you end long years of violence, of suffering, of repression, of crazinesses, jihadis in Kashmir or the Tamil tigers in the Tamil areas in northern Ceylon. We have to move forward towards that. The tragedy is that we no longer have politicians of vision in either country, really. Dynasties in both countries, you know, the Bhuttos in Pakistan, the Gandhis, Nehru Gandhis in India, the Bandaranaike's in Sri Lanka, the Mujibur Rahman family or the Zia Rahman family in Bangladesh, Nepal alone. Curiously enough, this country, which was in some ways socially the most backward, is now a shining example of a republican, democratic state which has been created. So we have to learn from each other. I think that has got to be the direction in which we move. I think a big problem has been that Pakistan has always been, the elite that rules Pakistan has always been attuned to North American time zones and sometimes Gulf time zones, but has ignored South Asia's own time zones. And they need to return to that time zone because that is where their future lies. And within India as well, there is a more enlightened section of the ruling establishment which should know that this is the way forward, both for the sake of the region and for the sake of India's large Muslim minorities in Kashmir and in the rest of the country.
Well, let's ask the enlightened part of Indian intelligentsia. What do you think?
You may change your mind later. I think while politicians are crafty characters and grubby characters, I actually have a somewhat higher opinion of recent statements from President Zardari, from Prime Minister Gilani and others, and Nawaz Sharif also. I think in the Pakistani civilian political movement, there is a significant change in priorities and historical awareness from what was there amongst the same persons maybe 20 years ago. President Zardari spoke a few days ago about having a security cooperation, mutual security in South Asia. I think that's a good idea. I mean, we're not there yet. We have to get to there from here, but he's taken some major steps. And the real change that that the dictator Musharraf made earlier, but which has been continued with the support of both Nawaz Sharif and Zardari, is to say that we're not going to resolve the Kashmir issue immediately, but that cannot. The whole of the subcontinent, the billion Indians, the fifth of a billion almost Pakistanis cannot be held hostage to that one issue, which is complicated, which involves many different small groups and their interactions. So I think he certainly would like to go that way. Now the new Chief of Army Staff also said that there's a national consensus in Pakistan about Kashmir. It wasn't clear to me which consensus he was talking about. It's not the kind of statement one likes to hear from a military leader to support the value of civilian supremacy. But for the time being, I think the military has not had a good experience with the last phases of its rule. So we are some time away from the next coup, and hopefully that won't happen at all.
All right, but did you say that you think that's a good idea to build United States of South Asia, or you said it's not a good idea?
It may be a good idea in a few decades. Right now, it's not a good idea. A lot of political work has taken place in the Republic of India. A lot of political work has taken place in Bangladesh. I don't think Bangladesh is particularly interested in becoming, subordinated to a larger political formation, especially when they can, if they want to, simply build bilateral relations with India, with Pakistan, Nepal, and all the other countries. Politicians.
Can I stop you because you said a very key word, subordinated. If it's going to be subordinated, obviously, I think the answer will be what you just said. But if it's going to be coordinated through a higher structure, a coordinating mechanism to each other's benefit, mutual benefit, then it's a totally different story. It seems to me what Tariq Sahib was saying goes back to actually Maulana Abul Kalam Azad's 1946 plan for mission, cabinet mission plan, which he gave to them, which will be autonomy, self-rule on most issues, and coordination to mutual benefit with little interference from the side. And it seems to me the SARC, whole idea of SARC and the economic cooperation they are talking about is actually moving in the direction of reviving that kind of a cooperation. We don't need to go back, but the idea is there. Idea has been there since 1946 of a regional cooperation for economic purposes. And given impetus by the fact that the whole world now is experiencing not only globalization, but a secondary tier of regional cooperation, which gives you a boost in the global competition. So do you think that South Asian countries can wait that long?
I think there's a difference between economic integration, which can proceed and which is now starting to proceed, and a formal political union. Europe, to get to where it is, went through certain historical experiences as sovereign states, which taught them certain lessons. But those lessons cannot only be learned in the foreign ministries. They have to be learned down to the ordinary people. And in South Asia, we don't have enough experience as sovereign states. Right now, we're in the period of the sovereign states, which were created in 1947 and a few years after, have some track record behind them. They're building up certain very positive human processes are taking place. New participation, new political parties coming up to represent people and led by people who have never exercised that kind of leadership in the last few centuries. Actually, I mean, the history of South Asia is quite ancient, and there's more to it. Still, it's pretty new in the last few centuries. So that is a very positive thing, and I think these constitutional unions which exist, what's happening in Nepal, I agree, is very positive. These must be allowed to go forward. They must be allowed to have their sort of normal sovereign processes. But meanwhile, of course, they should move towards the greatest political cooperation. They should respect each other's sovereign needs. And I think sort of inherent fundamental conflicts are quite limited in the region. There's no reason why the countries of the region cannot cooperate a great deal more than they're cooperating.
So your only objection is that the state structures are weak and not yet mature enough to handle that kind of integration, so we need to bring them up to speed and up to the par.
I think so, yes.
What do you think?
Well, I think it will take time, but you know, I'm a bit surprised to hear you say that Zardari is someone we can take seriously. This is a view which is not common inside Pakistan. The only reason he's president elected indirectly is because his wife bequeathed him the political party, and to the son made president for life, which is not exactly a good way to take politics forward. And what he wants or doesn't want is irrelevant, to tell you the truth. The key institution in Pakistan, there are two. One is the people and some of the parties. And the second, which is in fact the dominant institution in the country, is the army. And that is what it has been like since the 50s onwards, backed by the United States. Now, it's very obvious that Pakistan has been run by the United States, and the United States now wants them to move in the direction of India, since India has become a big new favorite, which it never was during the Cold War, but now it is a big US favorite. And the US might want the Indians to exercise dominance, but I don't think that is what I'm talking about. I am talking about an equal relationship between all these countries, and that if we ever reach that stage, a constitution for the South Asian Union which gives each country the right to veto, which you have in the European Union, whether the country is small or large, so that, excuse me, so that Bangladesh needn't fear, or Nepal, or Pakistan, that India can impose anything on us, because it's such a large country with a growing economy. But that if anything is against our interests, we can just put our hands up and veto it. That's quite a good constitutional safeguard. And I'm in favor of ending visa restrictions and allowing people to move freely. But of course, the countries will remain, as the European countries remain, sovereign states. There's no doubt about that in my mind. But I think, you know, where I see big problems is in the failure of people to move this program forward. The ordinary people, I think, want it. You know, the New America Foundation carried out an opinion poll in Pakistan a few months ago, and they found that while 70% of the population regarded the United States as the biggest danger to peace in the region, only 11% of Pakistanis saw India as the enemy. Now that represents a total earthquake in Pakistani political perceptions. And for me, that was incredibly positive, that ordinary people know that their future is in this region and not in any other. And once you have a South Asia Union, then, I mean, if we ever reach that stage, then when it comes to negotiating with the United States or any other power, the European Union, you do so as a collective entity and defend the interests of the smaller members of that union. It seems utopian now because we are a long way from it, but I think we have to popularize the idea because I can't see any other future for that region except breaking up. I mean, India probably won't, but there is talk today of the results of the Afghan war spilling over into Pakistan. The Americans are promising local politicians, if you play ball with us, we might even give you Pashtunistan. We might even give you Balochistan. In other words, break up the state. That would be a disaster, by the way, because that would then lead to adventurism on the part of the Pakistani military to stop that happening, and anything is then possible. So this is how I think we need to move forward an agenda for a unified South Asian entity, unified initially by removing restrictions, by removing trade barriers, and from that phase moving on to some form of a political union beneficial to all. The fear of India is very great. You're right about that, because it's so big. But I think there are constitutional safeguards that we
But
can
it
have.
seems to me what you said, Tariq Sahib, earlier, the 11% is the only percent left of people who are opposed to India or see it as a threat. Now the business people actually look at India as an opportunity, not as a threat that they thought will suffocate them. So there are newfound constituencies for peace in South Asia, in Pakistan in particular, in Punjab, that did not exist. And Lahore Accord came about because of them. That's what Nawaz Sharif would speak for them. But I think underlying there's an issue that I would like you to address. And that's the issue of Kashmir, because that's a stumbling block. Now, it seems to me Lahore Accord was an agreement on Oslo model, not that Oslo was very good in terms of consequences, but it said let's build peace and leave the most difficult issues for future date. And then came Kargil, and then whole thing went back, and then they went to Agra, and then said, okay, let's talk about the most difficult and the least difficult simultaneously. Let's have a basket of issues. And then it seems like after that, the whole process has been placed into circles. People are going through the same circle. And Zardari and his people said the same thing they had said previously. They said, we are very excited. We had a 1-hour meeting with Prime Minister Manmohan instead of 30 minutes that we had scheduled. Now, this is after 8 years of negotiation. If Pakistan can only celebrate extension of the meeting, that says something very terribly wrong with the whole process. So I want to ask you is, in your judgment, what are the policymakers in India thinking in terms of resolving this issue now or later?
I don't think that Indian thinking about Kashmir has changed significantly since 1947. I don't expect that it will. The Indian secularism has its own framework. It's not an ideal system, but it's the only workable system in India at this time. And part of it is that it is not permissible that because Kashmir has a Muslim majority, it will have different rules. Then the same secularism must be there in all states, regardless of which religion is in the majority. That's basically the contract. Now, in terms of Pakistan, I think you're both absolutely right in observing that the 11% finding is a new thing. Nawaz Sharif was elected in '97 based on the beginnings of such a trend, and the trend has only continued. Now, what I see as positive about Zardari, and its provenance is as ridiculous as you say, but people get to where they are by all kinds of means. At that point, they're there. And so then they either have to seize the historical moment and move forward, or they don't. Now, Zardari, and I agree that the army has been ruling in Pakistan for more than half of its history. It could make a comeback. So how much he can move, how much the Pakistani People's Party, how much the whole civilian movement can move Pakistan remains to be seen. It would be a big loss of privilege for the army, which is not likely to be happy about that. But right now, the army has other issues. The army has to deal with the guerrilla movements which are coming up in Northwest Frontier Province and coming into Islamabad itself. And that, so it has greater challenges than it has faced earlier. At the time of the coup, of the '99 coup and earlier coups, it didn't face those challenges. Making a coup was a relatively easy decision. Now it's a more complicated decision. So strangely enough, the rise of the extremists creates an opening for the civilian movement. Not a very satisfactory opening. It is quite possible that Pakistan will spend some time playing Cambodia once again, a country that is happily bombed in order to achieve the objectives of a superpower. But it's not a very happy opening, but given the history up till now, it's almost the best we can do. I don't think, the U.S. is going through a financial crisis. Obama, if he gets elected, would probably get out of Iraq pretty quickly. He may well end up getting out of Afghanistan not too much later if circumstances go a certain way. That's not how he's talking right now. But like Zardari, he will have to deal with the situation as it comes up. But that would not solve Pakistan's problem. That would be, or at least not the problem of the more secular religious movement. Then the jihadis would be even more powerful. And they
Let
would
me
use
ask you, recently 11 major mainstream Indian authors, including Arundhati Roy, went to Kashmir and came back and said we need to settle this problem. I think Arundhati Roy's words were not only we need to liberate Kashmir from India, we need to liberate India from Kashmir. And so large number of people who never spoke on this issue now are speaking. So people, the Indian intelligentsia is not fixed either. I want to sort of ask you to review your own comments earlier. It seems like there is a soul searching going on Indian side also. Even if they want to find a solution within Indian context, they know the present status quo cannot be sustained. Therefore, what are the possibilities of any other scenario that, because I think with all his flaws and faults, and given that he was so weak and vulnerable to American pressure, General Musharraf did offer a number of sort of new openings to India, which India did not seize. Given that that possibility is still maybe on the table, and yesterday what was very interesting was Zardari, he said we want bilateral talks. He did not concede as yet to Kashmiri demands of trilateral talks. Very clear. So given that, how do you see things playing out?
Arundhati Roy is certainly a prominent personality and widely reported. I think her writing is very good. I don't think her reasoning is equally good. I found myself in disagreement with her on a lot of issues.
No, I'm not saying that. What I'm asking you is,
Yeah.
respectfully, I'm sure you are critical of her, but I'm saying is, will you agree that some part of Indian intelligentsia has taken
Of
stand
course.
that didn't take? How do we account for that in the larger context? Is that going to bring an opening?
The Indian intelligentsia is a very large and diverse group of people. So there are parts of it that support almost any stand that you can name is supported by someone. So the fact that a group of authors has said this is not in itself politically significant. It changes the discussion in newspapers. She wrote a number of, in fact, a very interesting article came up in the same magazine, in Outlook magazine, where she published her article on Kashmir, rebutting her and suggesting that this is not the liberation that we're looking for. And that was...
That's K. Subramaniam, I think, article.
no, not K. Subramaniam. This was by a different author who is not prominent.
Subramaniam also wrote, but that to me shows
Yeah.
now there's a lively debate.
Yeah.
Previously there was no debate, now there's a debate. How do you look at the debate?
I think we cannot get away from the fact that the Kashmiris are deeply unhappy. Overwhelming majority of them. This last movement that we have seen in Kashmir, which Arundhati Roy and others have reported on, was unlike anything I've known before since Sheikh Abdullah's time in 48, 49 when he was locked up. In the sense that it was genuinely a mass movement, it was non-violent, and it united every strata of Kashmiri society, including the most opportunist politicians in Kashmir had to follow it for some time. And that is a sign that people are fed up. Now, in order to annoy the Indian government more, they raise slogans of long live Pakistan. I don't take that too seriously because by and large, if you talk to Kashmiri leaders, if they say anything, they say we don't want to be part of either of these countries. You know, if Lithuania can be independent and Latvia, why can't we be independent? They say that. So when you discuss with them further, and you say, well, what sort of independence do you want? You want your own army? You want it? Then they begin to change. No, we don't want our own army. We don't want to militarize Kashmir. We don't want anyone else's army too. So they've been unfortunate that the ISI sent in jihadis who were hated by lots of local people, not by others, but by lots. And then the Indian army was sent in, which behaved like an army of occupation. You know, rapes, repression, violence. So we have to just move away from geopolitics for a tiny bit and say, what about the Kashmiris? Do they have no rights at all? Are their rights going to be determined by these two states? And that, I think, is the dilemma, which is why I return to what I said, that within a wider framework, you can offer the Kashmiris something. You know, the end of the line of control, and an autonomous Kashmir without its own army or anything like that, but which everyone agrees is an autonomous region within a larger union, and the same for the Tamils, which we haven't discussed, which has been a thing going on now for a long time and much more violent than anything in Kashmir, is the fight of the Tamil Tigers against the Sri Lankan government. So I think that is the direction in which we have to move. And I don't see any other way out. I don't think Pakistan and India want another war on Kashmir. I don't think the Pakistani military, even its hardline elements, want that now because they see the dangers. Kargil was quite instructive for the adventurists inside the Pakistani military. You know, they couldn't do it. And the politicians who backed them understood this fact very well. So Kashmir is not a problem that is going to be solved by force. And the Kashmiris have now understood that. So the methods they use are non-violent civil disobedience, as the way India won its independence.
Before I go ahead.
I think the future of the Kashmiris is similar to those of the Nagas, small groups in the northeast, who also are not that happy in the Indian Union, and who have also pursued armed struggle in various. I mean, public opinion changes back and forth. Nothing will change. Tibet, somewhat the same thing. Actual Tibetans, they scaled the Chinese embassy wall in Delhi. Anytime they get a chance, Chinese hold an Olympics, they make the most of it. They'll keep on doing that. That's not going to stop. Nothing will change. Okay, there's a point at which, and there are big reasons for that. Okay, we can debate whether China really should have Tibet or not, but it has it now. And as far as China is concerned, the reason for keeping it goes back to the Opium War of 1840 and all that. Very similar reasoning takes place in India, that this is a big project that the Indian people have undertaken. It's a long project. They trace the project back through long periods of Indian history. And you know, because a small group, you say Kashmiris, of course it's not Kashmiris, it's Kashmiri Muslims in the valley. It's, you know, Shia Kashmiris don't necessarily feel that way. Hindu and Buddhist Kashmiris, of course, don't feel that way. And some Kashmiri Muslims in the valley don't feel that way.
But hang on a minute, just hang on a minute. The analogy with Tibet is, I think, not totally accurate, because the Chinese government never agreed after they took Tibet that no Han people could settle in Tibet. The Indian constitution had a clause inserted by Jawaharlal Nehru saying that no non-Kashmiris could enter Kashmir and settle there. That was a reason. And the reason, if you want to go back to it, is that there was an agreement with partition, whatever we might individually think of partition, that the Muslim majority areas of India would be allowed to vote on whether they formed part of Pakistan or India. And the Kashmiris were never allowed to vote, despite being a Muslim majority part of India. It goes back to that.
You're misrepresenting the actual agreement, which was not about Muslim. The Congress Party would never have agreed to a deal on the basis of Muslim majority or not. There were elections held in 1946 in the colonial setup, and indeed in most of the Muslim majority areas, the Muslim League did very well, and those parts became Pakistan. In fact, as of 1947, there was not majority support in Kashmir for the Muslim League.
No, for Sheikh Abdullah there was.
Okay,
and he demanded a referendum on whether on the Kashmiris being allowed to choose their own future, and Nehru agreed publicly to a referendum.
And in the United Nations.
I think we can debate the minutiae.
But this is not the minutiae. This is the very origins of the dispute.
That doesn't matter.
You mean now that a big state exists, it can do whatever it wants?
Exactly.
America does it, we can do it too.
It's not about America. It's a good state. It's a state meant to serve the people, a large diversity of people. And in order to do that, there have to be certain rules. It's not an ideal state, it's a problematic state, but there's a purpose behind the state which is good, and which does not end in Kashmir. It goes from Kashmir to Kanyakumari. And for that, certain rules have to be kept.
Now, let me ask you then, how do you interpret Indian Prime Minister's statement he just gave yesterday at the United Nations? He said we want to settle all disputes with Pakistan, including Jammu and Kashmir. Then how do we read that statement? If there is no issue of Jammu and Kashmir, then why is he saying we want to settle this?
Indian leaders have said very similar words.
But he's not just an Indian leader, he's Indian Prime Minister. He speaks for the entire state.
Yeah, so Indian prime ministers have said that. The Simla agreement says that. Of course, India wants to settle the agreement.
But according to you, there's no real problem at all, because the issue is really settled.
There is a problem, and there will remain a problem.
But you compare it to the Nagas, which is very different. You know, the Nagas, no big treaty was made with the Nagas. Basically, everything you're saying is trying to underplay the importance of the Kashmir region. That's what you're doing. And it's a very dangerous operation, this, because I'll tell you why. It's not just Kashmir. How Kashmir is treated reflects on the Muslim minority inside India itself and what the feelings of that is.
That connection is not quite what you might think. For the principle that secularism should be the same everywhere, while it is not very welcome among many people in the Kashmir Valley, those in the Indian Muslim community, which I think is a large majority of that community, understand that Indian secularism is an important thing, and the inclusion of Kashmir in India is part of that secularism, which is why Indian Muslims outside Kashmir have never substantially supported
Well, many of them, look, let's be frank, I mean, you know, they are scared. Lots of them feel they live in a permanent state of siege, especially during the BJP government. They were under heavy attack ideologically. Textbooks were being rewritten and changed. Then you had the massacre in Gujarat. So naturally, being a minority, they are careful. They don't want pogroms and they don't want to be killed. But that doesn't mean they have no sympathy for these people.
Sanjay, let's go to another issue, that is Afghanistan. How do you see the situation in Afghanistan complicating India-Pakistan relations?
Well, the situation, as I read it in Afghanistan, is that there was a Taliban movement created by Pakistan, and it was initially defeated. America decided to pursue other ventures, and it paid much less attention than it easily could have, and therefore did not do much to build an effective Afghan state. That may have been difficult, but one can imagine an application of money that would have.
You're talking about since 2001.
Yeah, since 2001.
Okay.
So now the situation, about a year ago, America decided to start spending more money doing that, and we'll see how it goes. But right now, America doesn't have and cannot easily get enough soldiers from any country into Afghanistan that will really handle the problem. And frankly, even sending Predators, these drones into Pakistan or doing anything else in Pakistan will not strategically affect the situation. It's the only path that I can see to prevent Taliban rule in Afghanistan, which I think is well worth preventing for the vast majority of the Afghan people, is for America and NATO to hold on, to take some casualties as they're taking, hopefully to inflict fewer civilian casualties than they are, but I'm not optimistic about that, and build up the Afghan army as quickly as they can. It has to be an army of a few 100,000, enough to seriously interfere with Taliban operating in eastern Afghanistan and entering from Pakistan. Once they get to there, then it'll still be a mess, but the U.S. can withdraw, and at least the civilian casualties that are coming from heavy U.S. firepower, at least those particular casualties will not be happening.
And you think that occupation itself will create some more resistance or no?
It has created some resistance, and it will create some resistance. But Afghans also know, they know where the Taliban come from. And so they don't see it simply as an American occupation, that they know that the Americans came in to throw out a Pakistani colonial enterprise which they were suffering under. And that if the Americans just up and leave, cruel as they are in their use of firepower, even if they up and leave, they'll be back under the same occupation.
But let me ask you one question before I bring Tariq in. The question is, now people are talking about neo-Taliban, which means the word Taliban has become something, the word kulak under Stalin, which meant one thing at one time, and then everybody who opposed Stalin became a kulak. Similarly, now Taliban is a code word for anybody opposing American presence. How do we account for this new, more complex entity? Because we cannot reject all of them under the same argument, because they are, reactionary, therefore they must be fought and defeated. There are people who are fighting it for nationalistic reasons and simply refusing to be subject to that kind of violence. How do we account for that and the fact that insurgency is increasing? And do you think that increase in insurgency is also embroiled in a proxy war between India and Pakistan?
I doubt that there's a substantial Indian component. It would be not easy for India to motivate Wahhabi-inspired Muslims to do anything.
How about Northern Alliance?
Maybe Northern Alliance, but Northern Alliance, I think India and Northern Alliance have a great similarity of views. But Northern Alliance is not heavily involved right now. It would become either the organizations of the alliance or the ethnic groups which form the Northern Alliance could become the basis of a future Afghan army. And no doubt those are the groups from which the U.S. is now recruiting. But that is not what's happening right now. What's happening right now is a struggle among Pashtuns and mainly between the U.S. and Pashtuns. The Afghan army does play a role in some of these operations. But I think India's role is quite secondary. India is a small fraction of the U.S. In terms of its impact on Afghanistan.
Do you see Indian connection, any difficulty for
I don't think
realization?
the Indian role in Afghanistan is significant, actually. I think really what has happened in Afghanistan is that the failure of the government imposed by the United States following the defeat of the Taliban has failed to deliver. It's corrupt. There's endemic corruption. Karzai's brother is well known as the largest heroin smuggler in the country. And all this accumulation of wealth by a tiny elite has now turned a large chunk of Pashtuns in Afghanistan against the occupation. If you read US intelligence reports coming in, and some of them are being published, others are being circulated, they're very desperate because they've seen the change and the shift taking place. I mean, about 4 weeks ago, the Financial Times sent a senior correspondent in there, and he just returned with a map which they published of the areas which are sympathetic to the insurgency. And he wrote that lots and lots of government officials officially working for the Afghan government privately will tell you that they want to get rid of this government and they support the insurgency. So it's as if the ship, it's like the Titanic. It's hit the iceberg. The US intelligence, the people working there know it's hit the iceberg, but news has yet to spread. So what is the way out? I think the US has to have, NATO has to have an exit strategy now, and an exit strategy soon. But what should replace it? For me, that's an important question. I do not think that a repeat of what happened after the defeat of the Russians and the Civil War with the imposition of a ultra-Wahhabi fanatical regime on Afghanistan helped the people of Afghanistan or anyone else, to tell you the truth. That is gone. The neo-Taliban, as the British intelligence units called them, are much, much wider than what was before. But even so, my feeling is, and I return to this, that it has to be a regional solution. So you have to have the withdrawal of America and NATO, but you have to have Pakistan, India as the big power, Russia and Iran coming together and saying, okay, we are prepared to support a government, a coalition government of all the forces in the country, of which the Pashtuns are the largest, for 10 years. Let's have a 10-year experiment. We will back them, no violence, we will come down on that quite heavily, give peace to a region where there's been war for 30 years, and let's reconstruct the country. You know, it's a long shot, but it's a better chance than anything that has happened so far. I think the Americans have lost it, basically, in sending 100,000 more troops, killing more people, expanding the war into Afghanistan is going to have a totally counterproductive impact. Yes. It has to be a regional solution involving these powers. And if the Pakistanis are talking to the Indians on all issues, they should discuss this, saying, we need your help, come in and help us. And the Russians and the Iranians. Whether the US likes it or not is neither here nor there. That is what the region needs. And increasingly, regional needs should be settled by regional players. That's my opinion, whether it's South America, whether it's South Asia, whether it's the Middle East. You can't do it unilaterally on a bilateral basis between the United States and one country.
But Tariq, I agree with everything you've said. However, I'd like to add, in Afghanistan, the democratic process has been used to disenfranchise the Pashtun majority.
I agree.
Whereas in Iraq, it was the Shia majority was brought into office and power. There it has been the reverse. Yeah. Unless that imbalance is restored one way or the other, it's not going to work. So there has to be a domestic component, a regional component with guarantees from international forces, and China is not going to, Russia is not going to allow permanent US to look at that. Let me ask you a very last question. We are practically out of time. How do we see the Shanghai Cooperative Council playing out in this scenario? And they were expanding their membership, as you know. And Kandli Sarai said, we think of Afghanistan as a member of SAARC and not of the Shanghai area. And we see them as part of South Asia, not part of Central Asia. I asked actually the Afghan ambassador, why didn't you seek full membership in the Shanghai Cooperative Council? He said, no, we are observers there. But you can go back and look at the dates. It was after Condoleezza Rice drew the line. They moved this way and not that way. Given that Shanghai Cooperative Council is there as a counterweight to this whole issue of American presence, how do you see SARC shaping up and Shanghai Cooperative Council shaping up?
It's tempting to view these associations that exist as alliances against something. It is a counterweight of sorts, and it's a healthy counterweight. I think the Shanghai Cooperative Organization is doing good work. It finds ways to reconcile the interests of China, Russia, and several Central Asian countries, and they have overwhelming common interests. All countries are taking a very sensible approach. So I think that will continue. Joining in South Asia into that would be tricky. I mean, there are some ways that it might work.
And I'm saying, how do you see SARC playing vis-a-vis Shanghai Cooperative Organization, given that U.S. insisted Afghanistan should join SARC and not the Shanghai Cooperative Organization?
SARC, regrettably, is a less functional international organization at this time than the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I think there's less of a conflict. The conflicts among the member states are much less in the SCO, and therefore the organization works well. SARC may move to that if the civilian movement, not necessarily Zardari, but I think all of the civilian parties have loosely similar ideas right now in Pakistan. If that somehow consolidates, maybe not in the entire territory of Pakistan, but in large parts of it, but if in a hopeful scenario there, SARC might work better. And then there are all kinds of pipelines that could be built, all kinds of cooperative agreements. Trade between India and China is growing quite rapidly. India is China's fastest growing trade partner. That is, there's no question that India and China have to work together. There's simply no other possibility, and it's just obscene that they should not. These are the two largest nations in the world. Great civilizations. They have, and they have no particular need to expand. We don't live in an age of the 19th century where you have to grab resources. So there's not even an incentive to expand in the way that world powers of the past few centuries have. So I think India and China, it's been a rocky relationship, but there's grounds for optimism. That I think China's willingness not to veto the nuclear deal at the nuclear suppliers group suggests that China is willing to permit India to play a role, maybe not quite at its own level, but somewhat closer to its own level than it was earlier. So India is not going to get to China's level next year, but it would like not to be permanently blocked from that level. And if such agreements can come about between India and China, it can be the basis of much wider circuits of cooperation. India and Russia already get along pretty well. China and Russia get along pretty well. So there's a lot of scope for cooperation in the larger Asian region in the future.
Last word.
I think I agree with that. I think it is in the interests of the region for close cooperation and collaboration between South Asia, China, Russia. I would add, if the Americans were ever to permit it, the whole Far Eastern bloc, Japan, possibly a unified Korean peninsula, would shift the relationship of forces globally. Japan is still not permitted its own foreign policy. It's an occupied country. Unlike Europe or the Germans, who are quite independent, the Japanese have not been permitted that. And there is a big fear in the United States amongst policymakers that were they to move out of Japan, there would be a temptation to have a strong Far Eastern bloc, which economically is, of course, very, very significant. So I think that is, I mean, the world is changing. There's absolutely no doubt about that. I think U.S. hegemony cannot be sustained indefinitely. And you just look at the map of the world and the economies. You know, China now is the workshop of the world. This is a country which is supplying large parts of the world and is playing that global role. India is trying to move forward. Though I would make one point. An Indian analyst told me, he said, China has problems in Tibet and it has problems in the Muslim region, minor compared to Tibet. In India, he said, 35% of our countryside is occupied by the Naxalbari people and peasants. There are movements there. But these movements can be talked with, actually, and sorted out what their demands are, etc. It's happened in Nepal. There's no reason why it can't happen in India. But the general trend is towards more regional cooperation. And I think that is the way of the future.
On that positive note, we'll conclude this discussion for today, and it will continue in many more sessions. Thank you.